Welcome everybody to our third session in our Two-Way Streets series. My name is Jean Guerin and I co-direct the Streets Project at University of Wisconsin-Madison, along with Araceli Alonso, who's spotlighted here. For those of you new to Streets, the project acronym stands for Social Transformations to End Exploitation and Trafficking for Sex. Streets was started about 6 years ago as part of a larger campus-wide initiative called 4W, which stands for Women, Wellbeing in Wisconsin and the World. And we also operate the Streets Project under the auspices of the UNESCO Chair on Gender, Wellbeing, and a Culture of Peace at University of Wisconsin. So we started Two-Way Streets last year during the pandemic, and a way to continue to reach out and have engagement opportunities with our network of survivors, practitioners, and researchers concerned with promoting the well-being of survivors of human trafficking. We've been selecting timely and topics that have emerged as important in our ability to support survivors. So we're delighted to have our fabulous speakers with us today. Shamere McKenzie is a speaker, a trainer, a survivor leader, just an extraordinary person. She is also the CEO of the Sungate Foundation, which provides educational opportunities to survivors of trafficking. She's also the anti-trafficking ambassador to Jamaica, which is a pretty cool title, Shamere. But you also have her full bio that was sent around earlier. Our other speaker, Jessica Emerson. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you for being here. Jessica is at University of Baltimore School of Law. She runs the Human Trafficking Prevention Project and has also just a range of fabulous experience that you can check out in her bio as well. I'm going to do those short intros though, because we want to get right to the topic, but I just want to tell everybody attending that these are incredibly sought after speakers and trainers. So we feel very fortunate to have them with us, and we're eager to hear what you have to share with us about criminal record relief for survivors. So Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, before I do, I would like to encourage everyone to please submit questions at any time through the Q&A function, which is on the lower part of your screen. And Ara will be fielding those questions. You can submit them while Jessica and Shamere are talking. I'll be moderating the discussion, but Ara will be watching that. We also, you also have the chat function, but we'd prefer if you put your questions into the Q&A. All right, so Jessica, over to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Emerson, and I direct the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, which is a partnership between the University of Baltimore School of Law and the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. And I am very thankful to our hosts for allowing Shamere and I to speak today on a topic that you will soon see the two of us are incredibly passionate about. We kind of joke that we just take the show on the road and just let Shamere and I talk about this, and the passion seems to kind of flow out of us when we talk about this. So what I'm going to do, at least right now, is just set the stage for why this topic is important and why criminal record relief is important, and then we'll get into some more specific kind of Q&A with Shamere and I. So I am going to share my screen. Okay. If anyone has any problem seeing anything, let me know, but it worked before, so hopefully it'll continue working. Okay. So I am, although I direct the Human Trafficking Prevention Project at the University of Baltimore School of Law, I'm also a member of the Freedom Network and the Survivor Reentry Project, which you'll learn more about. It's a national organization that focuses on criminal record relief for survivors of trafficking. So I'm kind of wearing a number of hats today. So I want to set the stage for this discussion by helping the participants think about not only what is the impact of, how many survivors are impacted by having criminal records and what that looks like in terms of impact on their lives. And if at any point, I know Shamere will jump in, and Jean as well, if there are questions that are better suited for different parts of this material, please feel free to jump in. But for now, let's just focus on something called the National Survivor Network Survey that was done in 2016. National Survivor Network is, exactly as it stated, a national network of survivors of both sex and labor trafficking. The leadership did a survey of both sex and labor trafficking survivors within their network. US survivors, foreign nationals, individuals living in the US, individuals living abroad. And the impact of or intersection with the criminal legal system was pretty shocking, as you'll see, which is that 91% of survivors reported having an arrest record. That is not a little number. That is an enormous number. 91% reported having some sort of interaction with the criminal legal system. Of that 91%, over 50% reported that every single arrest on their record was trafficking related. So that tells us a lot. That tells us, obviously, that 50% reported that every arrest on their record was trafficking related, but that another, close to half have a whole bunch of things on their record that either preceded or, were as a result of the period of instability that so commonly follows a trafficking experience. 42% of that 91% reported having an arrest record, a trafficking related arrest record when they were minors. Over 40% reported being arrested over 9 times or more. These are not little tiny criminal records with one thing here or there. These are at times tremendously vast criminal records. And then what's important to the material that's going to come after this is that 60% reported being arrested for crimes other than prostitution. That's one of the main challenges that we face when we talk about kind of evening the playing field around the country with different criminal record relief statutes. So how do conviction and arrest records impact everyone, but impact survivors? And the reason that we have both conviction and arrest records is that, I'll use Maryland as an example. You can be arrested and not convicted for a crime, and you still have a criminal record, even if it's a not guilty or if the prosecution declined to prosecute. It doesn't matter. You still have a criminal record. So the harm doesn't begin when someone is convicted of a crime. The harm begins when someone is arrested for a crime. So individuals, generally speaking, with conviction and arrest records have difficulty obtaining employment, gainful employment, have difficulty obtaining safe housing, furthering their education, accessing benefits, and obtaining financial assistance. Credit is typically impacted, especially by a trafficking experience, family stability, and immigration relief or adjustment of status. Having an arrest record impacts all of these things. And so when we kind of use that lens to consider the impact on survivors, if survivors can't do all these things, they can't get the job that they want, or even obtain gainful employment or employment in the mainstream economy, safe housing, can't further their education, their family stability is impacted. All of those things can result in survivors not being able to heal from the experiences that they've had, being impacting their ability to heal. So this is something that as an anti-trafficking community, we started to figure out in 2008, 2009, which you'll see. But I love this quote. It's from a survivor seeking criminal record relief. It said, "I knew that if they fingerprinted me, I would have to deal with all these memories again. And I knew they wouldn't hire me," right? So this is someone who perhaps has escaped a trafficker maybe even 20 years ago, and knowing that just getting fingerprinted and knowing that just having a criminal record brings them right back to those experiences time after time. And so what we actually started to do in 2009 was New York became the first state in the country to pass a criminal record relief law for trafficking survivors, okay? And just to let you know how things have changed since 2009, and in the context of legislation and the criminal legal system, 10, 11 years is not that long of a time, but look at our map as of last year, right? So at this point, there are only 5 states that don't have some form of criminal record relief on the books that's specific to survivors. However, what we started to see was that the statutes in different states offered wildly different criminal record relief. Okay, so what do criminal record relief laws cover? The answer is it depends. Unfortunately, the process varies from state to state. Unfortunately, the relief varies from state to state. Some laws cover arrest records, some laws don't. Some laws cover accessing court documents, some laws don't. Some laws cover vacating or essentially reversing convictions or finding of guilt, and some laws don't. So what that has resulted in, although obviously every state that's enacted something like this has done a good thing, that if I am a survivor with a criminal record in 5 different states, I may be able to completely rid myself of my criminal record in one state, get a few things off in another, get nothing off in a third, and then have all different types of varying processes in the 4th and 5th states. And that is challenging and also really frustrating for survivors, because if we're telling a survivor that when you were being trafficked and you engaged in a criminal act and you were caught and you were convicted, or you were even charged, and that this wasn't your fault because at the time someone was using force, fraud, or coercion to control your actions, and therefore you weren't criminally responsible for your actions, but there's nothing we can do for you in X state, we're not really kind of fulfilling the promise of criminal record relief laws. So in 2019, in partnership with Polaris and the American Bar Association, the kind of house mother of all this work, Kate Mogulescu at Brooklyn Law School, and myself at UB Law, we attempted to try to encourage states to more uniformly adopt criminal record relief laws in the country. So what we did was we put together a model criminal record relief law, and then we graded each one of the states. So this is actually, I can make sure that I send it to Jean and that it's available, but it is available on Polaris's website, and it's a great report to give a read through because it gives way more of an introduction to criminal record relief laws than I am going to be able to do. So what we did was, as you can see on the left, we set up different types or different pieces of criminal record relief laws that are important, and we gave them scores. So for states that offered a full range of relief in terms of offenses that are eligible, they would get 10 points. For states that covered both arrests and convictions, they would get a full 10 points. But essentially what we considered was the material on the right, was which case dispositions were covered. Do criminal record relief laws cover arrests and convictions, or just convictions? What offenses are eligible? The majority of the early criminal record relief laws only covered prostitution because that's all we necessarily knew about, 10 years ago. And then we started to see that, or we started to understand that survivors were criminalized for a whole host of other criminal issues. Who decides whether or not the survivor can access the relief? So in Maryland, we actually had a criminal record relief law up until last year where the state decided whether or not the survivor could access the relief, not the judge. What do survivors have to show to access relief? Are there any burdensome or limiting conditions on the survivor being able to petition for relief? Is confidential survivor information protected? And does the relief leave survivors as complete as possible? Essentially, a perfect criminal record relief law would leave the person as if they had never been arrested in the first place, right? There is no record, it does not linger, it's as if the person was never arrested in the first place. And so we kind of took that model and then graded the laws of other states. So in 2019, this has since changed, and I'm hoping that we're going to do kind of an update, but in 2019, this was the top 5, and then we kind of went down from there. As you can see, Wisconsin ranks a little lower than you would probably want it to rank. It scored a 44, but I mean, I hope you can understand to see that there, a B was the best score in 2019, and the majority of states had a D or an F. So don't feel too bad, Wisconsinites, and we're going to talk to you about what needs to change about your law in the second half. So for those of you who are working with survivors, one of the things that we want to make clear before we start talking in greater detail about criminalization of trafficking survivors, we wanted to give you essentially best practices and some sample assessment questions that you can incorporate into the work that you do. So when you are working with a survivor, obviously, when folks are exiting a trafficking situation, we're worried about safety, we're worried about immediate emergency housing, we're worried about access to food and basic survival needs. But if we don't expand our repertoire in terms of what we ask survivors about, and we completely skip over asking survivors about whether or not they have a criminal record, the way that I look at it is we're essentially sending survivors back into the community with a target on their back. Because like I said in the previous slide, we are talking about folks who will not be able to get or keep employment, get or keep housing, continue their educational endeavors, get a loan, get a credit card. Criminal records impact all of these things. So when working with a survivor, you're going to want to make sure at some point you are asking about arrest history. You're going to want to talk with survivors and identify the ways in which they have interacted with the criminal legal system. That's really important because the criminal legal system is confusing, and it is confusing by design. And so I never expect the survivor to be like, I have 3 cases in Maryland and 2 in Delaware and 1 in New York, and I know exactly what the disposition of every single one of those cases was. If you know anyone like that, please send them to me because I'd love an easy case. It just doesn't work like that. And the criminal legal system makes sure of it. So you want to, talk about, have you ever been arrested? Have you ever had have contact with law enforcement? Were you ever in a courtroom, right? Just asking those general questions to kind of prompt survivors, thought process around these. Explore the extent to which someone's criminal history has impacted their independence and their stability. Share information about post-conviction relief. Something as simple as, I went to this presentation and I learned that in a lot of states, including Wisconsin, there is relief or legal relief that is available for survivors who have criminal records, and let me refer you to somebody who can tell you more about it. Obviously, you want to follow through and make those referrals. And also you can be a ginormous help in gathering corroborating documents for the attorneys that are doing this work. We've just given you some sample assessment questions. Were you ever arrested during the time you were trafficked? What states were you arrested in? Do you know what you were arrested for? Do you have any current criminal court cases or open warrants? And then most important, because I don't necessarily expect that anyone's going to know that information, as accurately enough to give it to me, have you gotten a fingerprint record? Right? That's going to be really important because that's going to tell you way more than most anyone can remember or understand about their criminal record. As far as whether or not you get a state or a multi-state or a countrywide background, it's usually pretty easy to get these multi-state criminal histories, and that'll really give you the broadest understanding of someone's criminal record, because like I said, they may have been trafficked in multiple states and don't necessarily remember getting a summons to appear for something in a state that they were just passing through. So there are multiple options for getting this countrywide background. You can send in fingerprints to the FBI. That takes forever. Or you can use an approved channeler. And those of us who do this work all have our favorites. I use something called FieldPrint, and it is relatively cheap, and the results are back within 24 hours. So I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a primer around why criminal record relief is important, and also give you some concrete tools to use after you've completed this training and are going back to your work with survivors. So I'm going to stop there. Do you want me to unshare my screen? Is that best? Gotcha.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. That was a great introduction. I think I might just dive right in. I just answered a question from someone about whether your PowerPoint will be available, and I clarified to them that we will send around a PDF version of it to all registrants right after we're done here. And then we do, I see the other question. I think I'm just going to start with a good question that was submitted, and I have a few of my own to go afterwards. But One attendee says, is having an arrest record common in the US? I think for, generally for people, is this public information, or would employers have to pay for a background check to find this?
The answer, as usual, is it depends. because every state has different procedures. Shamere and I are in Maryland. There is something called Maryland Judiciary Case Search, which as a joke is great for dating, not so good if you want to get a job or housing in the state of Maryland, because in large part there have been some changes, but generally speaking, your criminal record is visible to the public. So criminal court records are considered public documents. So anyone can access criminal court records. Whether or not someone needs to go into a courtroom to access them, and get request records from the clerk or pay for them, or can simply access them free online, it all depends on the state. So every state has a different procedure. Whether or not having an arrest record is common, absolutely. I think we have 73 million adults have some form of a criminal record. It's incredibly common. And as we know, it's incredibly even more common among survivors. So the answer is yes, and it depends.
Well, and I would say we are going to have, for everyone's information, we're going to have a more detailed discussion of Wisconsin later, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end. But I do know, and I can't say the right name, but we have a public court database system, which is actually kind of, it's very easy to find out in Wisconsin if anyone has an arrest or absolutely anything on them. Open to the public, so you can go and check. So that's, good or bad, but I think it's a problem in this case.
It's good and bad, and also the majority of employers do background checks that go above and beyond just perusing a public database. So a lot of that, depending on the job, is driven by state statute. If I'm going to work with vulnerable people, right? If I'm going to work with older adults, or I'm going to work with children, right. Or even if I'm in any sort of health profession or cosmetology or, there are a tremendous amount of licensures within the, from state to state, that whether or not you are able to do that job is very much dependent on your criminal record. So in many cases, if I'm applying for nursing, I'm going to get fingerprinted. And so even in the situation of a public database, it's not going to tell us everything typically, but you are probably going to get fingerprinted, and employers do have to pay for that. But typically if they're doing mass amounts of fingerprinting, there are, arrangements that can be made with the state. But yeah, getting a job in most cases, and especially if you're getting a licensed job, is going to involve getting fingerprinted and having your background check looked at.
Yeah. So Shamere, I wonder if you could help us a little bit understand sort of what are some of the types of offenses that survivors have, maybe other than prostitution, and then maybe also comment on the difference between state and federal offenses or convictions or things like that.
It is very important to understand that when we are talking about trafficking, this is a complex issue. A lot of people look at it just from like that black and white standard and say, well, trafficking, it's a crime. And so if someone is caught engaging in trafficking, that's the crime, right? But there are other crimes that individuals who are a part of a trafficking ring engage in, some of it not on their own accord, some of it they're forced to, and some of it is simply survival, right? And I have to stress that, simply survival. For example, when we talk about survival, if in my trafficking stable, my trafficker states, if you don't make your quota, you can't eat, right? And a quota is the amount that a person must make each day, each night, or each location, right? So that is the amount of money that someone must make. And a trafficker will oftentimes say, well, if you don't meet your quota, you can't eat, right? Now I'm hungry, right? My stomach is touching my back, right? Traffickers don't give you money and say, hey, here's $10 for lunch. I know you're going to be working for 12 hours. Here's 12 hours for lunch. It doesn't work like that. So simply to survive, I don't have money. What do you think I may do? I may steal food to meet that hunger, right? And stealing is a crime, right? So I may get charged with petty theft, right? And now, right? So I'm simply trying to survive here. I'm simply trying to get some food, right? And remember the shame and guilt that associated with it. People may say, well, why don't you just ask someone to buy you food? Think about the shame and the guilt that comes along. This is why I start off by saying trafficking, we have to understand the complexity of trafficking, right? It's not just a straight cookie cutter, hey, it's trafficking, this is it. Engaging in commercial sex is not the only crime, right? So there are other things like petty theft or other crimes, the Mann Act, that I'm all too familiar with, right? The Mann Act is a very old piece of legislation implemented in 1910 after a senator out of Illinois, right? It's also known as the White Slavery Act. So when we talk about racism and trafficking, think of the Mann Act, right? Still on the books, where it talks about transporting individuals across state lines for illegal purposes, which traffickers often force their victims to do. Drive across state lines, right? So if you drive across state lines under the direction of your trafficker, that is a crime. And that is a federal. You can be criminalized on a federal level, right? So when we talk about federal versus state, they are similar but different. Right? They're similar, and I'm going to let the lawyer, Jessica, explain that some more, the federal versus state. But think that when just keep in mind that trafficking is complex, and engaging in commercial sex is not the only crime victims are forced to commit, but there are other crimes, and those crimes vary. And when we talk about crimes that victims are forced to commit, I'm not just talking about petty crimes. It can grow up to murder. And I'm going to let Jessica talk more about that federal versus state and how we differentiate those.
I want to actually go back to something you said, Shamere, that I think is really powerful. And I don't think I've ever set it up the way that you did, but I think I'm going to have to start doing that. I think, yes, it's really important for us to understand that trafficking is complex and that things aren't black and white. But I loved how you said the crime in trafficking is the trafficker doing the trafficking, and we have to arrest that person. Fine. But in so many circumstances, and I hope that you can see it by that 91%, right, Shamere, that there's a lot of intersection between victimization and criminalization. So people can kind of occupy both points at the same time. They can be the victim of the crime of human trafficking, but they can be the one in the courtroom that is accused of incredibly, sometimes violent and serious acts. Shamere's definitely right that the majority of what we see are misdemeanor crimes relating to survival, relating to prostitution. A lot of the clients that we work with are street-based homeless, and so there are a lot of things that people need to do in order to exist while living on the streets. Trespassing. Drug use is both a predictor of trafficking in terms of being able to control someone, but it's also something that trafficking survivors do to survive their experience. And so having drug convictions on someone's, or drug arrests or convictions on their records, are incredibly common. But we've seen trafficking victims arrested in more complex situations where a trafficking survivor will book a date with a prostitution customer, and then a trafficker or the trafficker's friends will rob them, right? So they're implicated in a robbery scheme. We have definitely had survivors who have been implicated in, assaults, murder. So it really does range from both, those minor misdemeanor crimes all the way up to very serious state crimes. But Shamere's also right that then you can also take things up a notch and be charged with federal crimes. So the federal government does not dictate things like, local criminal laws, like what is prostitution, what is trespassing, minor amounts of drug possession. The feds will, or typically, at least now, will step in, on a federal trafficking case, but it is incredibly common that if there are minors involved, for instance, and a trafficking survivor, in order to survive, has become incredibly compliant, again, in order to survive the experience themselves, and will kind of be promoted to middle management in, the trafficker's scheme. And this doesn't have to be a large scale trafficking organization. It can be one person and one trafficking survivor, but if there are multiple victims, and the trafficking survivor is, handling money or booking dates, or like Shamere said, taking people across state lines, then the feds can step in and actually charge survivors with federal crimes, the least of which is the Mann Act. And I just have to kind of reflect on what Shamere said about the quote unquote White Slavery Act. This is actually, the Mann Act was used in order to initially to criminalize Black men for taking white women across state lines for consensual relationships. So it was a tool of racism. And it's ironic that, there have been changes to that law, but the majority of individuals who are survivors who are criminalized under that law are Black women. So we've twisted the law around in order to continue to have, or to perpetuate its racist undertones. So again, states monitor and arrest and convict based on their own local criminal laws, and the feds will step in on larger quote unquote crimes, and trafficking survivors can be wrapped up or caught up in all of those things.
So following on that, actually, I had another question in talking to a survivor friend of mine, talking about the complexity between, or maybe the relative ease of getting rid of the minor things. I mean, still always complicated, but that, felonies make it 10 times harder just because they're more serious. Can you maybe comment a little bit on that and how our laws are addressing that or not yet? Naturally.
Felonies are more serious, right? Felonies are more serious than misdemeanors. I think the easiest way to kind of think through this is again thinking about licensure, right? So when we talk about collateral consequences of having a criminal conviction, right? Those are penalties that attach to having a criminal record. Some of those are mandatory. As soon as a conviction happens, certain penalties kick in. So if someone is charged and convicted of a felony, federal felony, they're no longer allowed to carry a firearm, or a sex offender registration, which unfortunately, that is another thing that's perpetuated against survivors of trafficking. I know numerous survivors who have been forced to register as sex offenders, even though they themselves were sex offended against, and that's because of these mandatory penalties that attach to certain convictions. So felonies are, because they are more serious and are considered as such in the world of collateral consequences, a lot of felonies operate as absolute bars to certain types of employment, whereas misdemeanors don't. But it's not that black and white, because there are a whole host of what we call discretionary collateral consequences. And these are penalties that courts, that employers, that state licensing agencies are allowed to use as bars to employment or limitations to employment, but are not required to. And so unfortunately, then we get into people's personal biases about certain types of convictions. Prostitution, obviously we know, comes with a whole host of judgment, from the quote unquote outside world of people not involved in the work that we do. And so, a state licensure looking at a nursing candidate that sees a whole host of drug convictions and prostitution convictions might make a really discriminatory judgment about that person's ability to do their work, and not necessarily take the extra step to understand the story behind those convictions. And again, going back to what Shamere said about things are not black and white, and when we attempt to try to make them as such, we are going to miss the nuance and complexity, not only of the crime of human trafficking, but of the nuance and complexity of people's lives. And it's actually the reason why there is a push, a national push for what are called ban the box type legislation. And essentially it boils down to, on your first sweep through an application, there's typically, have you ever been arrested or convicted? And there's a checkbox, right? And so that application I can just very easily throw out and focus my time as an employer or a landlord on those individuals who haven't checked that box. And what ban the box type legislation allows us to do is for someone who would normally check that box to get their foot in the door, right? And explain that they are more than their criminal records and that they are more than the things that they have been accused of or convicted of. And when we just decide that, criminal records indicate that someone is a bad person, we're denying ourselves the opportunity to learn about that person's life. And for survivors, that's, unfortunately the death knell to a lot of types of employment and housing.
And when we talk about, survivors and that restoration process, and it's not even the restoration because it's more like continuing life, moving on, right? When we talk about that and what that looks like, that varies on an individual basis. And a criminal conviction is a roadblock on the road to restoration, right? So like Jessica said, when if you work with a survivor, you're like, yes, I want you to come out of this life and I want you to continue to go after your goals and hopes and dreams. But if my dream is to own a house, if my dream is to go back to school, if my dream is to become a nurse, right? And I can't get housing, I can't get access to education, I can't pass the exam, the licensure to become a nurse, then what hope are we really putting in line for survivors?
I mean, I think we're setting them up for failure now.
Exactly. And
right?
And re-trafficking, ultimately re-trafficking. Right?
Yes.
Because if society as a whole is not providing that support, and remember, when we're talking about these criminal penalties, oftentimes is as a direct result of their victimization. So you're telling me I am victimized at the hands of my trafficker, and then I'm re-victimized by society or by the legal system.
It also can undermine a survivor's faith in a provider, right? Because we're saying, there's things have stabilized, right? And you've exited the trafficking situation and we've got you emergency housing. Now go out and conquer the world. Bye. Without having those conversations. And I will just put a small plug in for some of the work that we've done at the Human Trafficking Prevention Project. It's not just criminal records that can impact a survivor's ability to move on with their lives and achieve their goals. Consumer law issues factor in, housing law issues factor in. Immigration obviously is a whole nother ballgame that I am not qualified to discuss. Having protective orders taken out against you, it can impact your ability to move on. Your criminal record can impact your ability to parent your children as far as the court's concerned. So it's not just criminal records. There are, a ton of different intersections with different types of civil law, in addition to interactions with the criminal legal system, that prevent survivors from fulfilling whatever destination in their lives that they've decided that they want.
Jean, we have wonderful questions. So Shamere and Jessica, I'm holding one of the questions for a little bit later that is more like applicable. What can we do about this? But there is a very related question. Does the criminal record relief only apply to adult survivors? Where do minors fall in this process? Very relevant for this discussion now.
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that although minors can be charged as adults, if they are charged with a crime as a minor, they're not going to have a criminal conviction on their record. They're going to be adjudicated delinquent by the juvenile legal system. And unfortunately, my answer once again is it depends. So some criminal record relief laws that are specific to trafficking survivors, Wisconsin being one of them, includes both juvenile records and adult records. In Maryland, for instance, Maryland's criminal record relief law focuses on adult criminal convictions, but Maryland has a juvenile expungement statute. But as far as the impact on all of the things that Shamere and I have been talking about in terms of goals for survivors, juvenile charges are not going to be as impactful because they are there are significant limitations in terms of who can access them. They're not going to be visible on public databases like Wisconsin or Maryland has. They're not going to come up on fingerprints. If a minor is charged as an adult, they are, but they're simply not as impactful. The other thing to keep in mind is that in certain states, like in New York, when I was a social worker for 10 years before I went to law school, because apparently no amount of student loan debt is too little. When I was a social worker, our clients, at that point, I was working exclusively with adolescents. So the adolescent survivors were routinely charged as adults with prostitution and things like that. Or, you know, someone who gives a fake date of birth and a fake name. So there are exceptions to that. But generally speaking, adult criminal convictions are far more impactful on individuals being able to move on than our juvenile charges.
Okay, great, Jessica. Maybe we can go, this question will be for both of you. What are the first steps you would recommend for having survivors get criminal record relief and setting them up? That's important for success in getting jobs, housing, etc. Like, other than just understanding what is their situation, how real, what can we do about it just to set them up for success if they have criminal histories?
Make referrals to programs that do this work. And we're going to cover this again at the end. You know, reach out to Shamere, who refers people to us all the time. The first thing is the discussion. You have to start talking about it. You have to ask those questions. Because again, if you're like, oh, you're stable, we have you in emergency housing, bye, you're not even going to get there. So you have to start that discussion. We do recommend, you know, fingerprinting to the best of your ability financially in terms of your program. For instance, for us, for the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, we have funding built in to get people fingerprinted, because then that allows us to see what's on their record and allows us to be able to figure out the best way to tackle things, because there are so many laws that are different from the next. And the way that the process typically works, and again, there's always changes to this, but typically, or best case scenario, would be an attorney who is in, you know, the same state or city with the survivor, who can work directly one-on-one with them on criminal record relief in a certain state. And then what we typically do from there, like for instance, if I get a referral from Shamere for someone with a Maryland criminal record, right, I'm going to work to help the survivor access criminal record relief in Maryland. And the way that we do that, and we'll get into this when we talk more about the Wisconsin law, is the evidence of the survivor's trafficking is the survivor story. So we work on crafting that, we put that together, we corroborate it as best we can, sometimes we can't. And then once that's done, then I will refer to, you know, to Jean in Wisconsin, and for, you know, the survivor's Wisconsin record, and then we'll refer to the next state. And there's a balancing act that kind of goes into this based on what type of conviction, you know, what the person's been convicted of, whether or not they have any open charges at the time, whether or not there are any outstanding warrants. But the process is, you know, kind of as simple as get in touch with someone. And through the Survivor Reentry Project, I have information on the last slide that you can access. The way that the Survivor Reentry Project is organized is there is a website where survivors or providers can actually submit a request for assistance. They do training and technical assistance. If you have no idea what's going on in your state as far as criminal record relief and you don't know who to reach out to the Survivor Reentry Project. And there's training and technical assistance for service providers, and like I said, a portal for survivors to themselves confidentially request assistance. Anyone who has a survivor with a Maryland criminal record, you can contact me and you can contact Shamere. But the Survivor Reentry Network, it's really, the goal is to have a one-stop shop for folks who don't know where to refer the survivor or who have, convictions in multiple states.
It's also important to note that when you're working with survivors discussing a criminal history, they may be hesitant to do so. So I would advise you to set up the question in a way that provides context for your questioning, right? So I'm asking you these questions because there's a possibility, right? I want to know if that we can provide some kind of criminal relief to you, right? Whether that means getting these charges vacated or expunged. Right? So when you present the question in that context, right, I'm a little bit more inclined to want to know more, right? But if you just come and say, hey, have you ever been, fingerprinted or interacted with the criminal justice system or been arrested, I'm going to be like, whoa, like, are you going to kick me out of your program? Are you connected with law enforcement? So provide some context around why you're asking this question, even before you ask the question. Jessica showed that beautiful map that, there's some kind of criminal relief in all except 5 states, right? So look on that map, see if your state is a part of the others that are providing that relief and say, hey, in providing you with services, right? I want to help you move on from some things that you may not even be thinking about right now. And one of those things is that criminal record, right? And of course, also, when we talk about agency and choice, we have to put that at the forefront of our work. Understand that a survivor, even though you may tell them that, we have these criminal relief programs, they may not want to participate at this time because the fear is still there. The guilt is still there. There's other concerns. There, the lies told to them by their traffickers, those lies are still present, right? So you may present the package of, hey, I want to help. And they're like, nope, I don't want to do that. Nope, I don't want to talk about it. Nope. And it can also be triggering and re-traumatizing based on how they interacted with the legal system, right? So give them back that choice and be comfortable as a provider to say, hey, and Jessica can tell you, I did this with her, right? Let me just share this really quick story, right? So I am a survivor. I have a felony as a direct result of my victimization. Worked with Jessica. We have no federal relief, no criminal relief on a federal level, except for a presidential pardon. But with the presidential pardon, you have to say, yes, I was wrong. I committed a crime, and please forgive me for the crimes I committed. Jessica explained that to me, and we took probably about 2 years to do the fingerprinting, gather materials and stuff. And she's like, okay, we're going to go for a presidential pardon. Is this what you're up for, Shamere? In the beginning, I'm like, yes, let's do this. Blah, 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 blah. Last day, guys, remember, did I say it was about 2 years? And Jessica, correct me if it was longer, because I'm believing it was, right? Last day, I'm meeting with Jessica now. And this meeting is about going over the final things to put all the information in the document in an envelope to mail it off. I go to meet with Jessica, and I've been thinking about this, and I'm like, Jessica, I don't want to mail this off. And she's like, okay, explain to me why you're feeling this way. I said, one, this, with me being a survivor leader, I don't want other survivors to feel like you have to apologize for your victimization, right? And I am not going to apologize for something that was done to me, right? Now, if we could do a quick poll, I would ask you, what do you think Jessica's response was? And in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's going to be upset. We've been working on this for 2 years. She's done all this work, fingerprinting and contacting all these states and getting all this information. And in my head, I'm like, she's going to be mad because this is a lot of work. And all we have to do now is put the paperwork in the envelope and mail it off. She was like, girl, high five, right? I was was in her office sitting across. She's like, high five. That is your choice. And if that's what you believe, I'm going to support you on that 100%. Nope, we're not going to mail it. And I'm like, you're not mad about all the work that we did? And she's like, no, because the choice is yours. And if that's how you feel, and she even agreed, she said, I agree with you, right? If that's what this choice that you want to take, that's what we're going to do. Don't worry about that. And she also explained, like, it was a learning process for her because she learned some things in the process. So don't feel like she wasted time, because she's like, each of these things are different, right? So I worked on yours so I can better help someone else who may want to do this, right? So she didn't like make me feel guilty about it. She was more excited, high-fiving. And I'm like, wait, you're not mad? Right? And that was an example to show about the choice and agency given that back to the survivor, since that was taken away from them during trafficking, when the trafficker had that agency and choice. So in all of our work, that agency and choice should be present.
Not gonna lie, I still have it in case she changes her mind, of course. But and also Shamere feeling that way doesn't diminish the experience of the clients that I've had that have decided to do it. And they're like, you know what? I know this sucks and there's no federal relief, but right now this is a step that I can take to try to put this behind me. Right? That is fine. And we've submitted several since Shamere's case, but she hits the nail on the head again. The hallmark of trafficking and trauma in general is a lack of control. Right? And a lack of control that to the point that it overwhelms someone's capacity to cope. Right? And so when you are working with survivors, the last thing you want to do is mirror some of the experiences that they had with their trafficker. And that comes with, making blanket decisions for the survivor, deciding how to define their experiences until they have time to work to define them for themselves. And when I train, and I'm pretty sure Shamere has definitely seen this training. When we talk about working with survivors of trauma, deciding that their trafficking experience, for instance, is the worst thing that's ever happened to them. That's not a decision that I can make, right? And if I do that, not only am I reinforcing that I know better than the survivor, so the power differential is totally screwed up, but I am perpetuating that lack of control in the life of a survivor. And Shamere's right. Every single survivor that I work with, I learn something new from. It's never a waste of anyone's time. But, now I've also had some survivors who have done this and gone through the process and stuff, but they have their entire criminal record all handily put together. They have their narrative all ready for the book that they're going to write. I mean, there's 1,000,001 different ways that people can use the material that we put together for criminal record relief. But it is important that the survivor drives the process entirely. I'm there to provide the legal expertise. I'm there to tell you what the law says and how to access it and what I need to be able to do that. Then the process is turned over entirely to the survivor.
So could you also, before we move on to the next section, Shamere, especially, but both of you, comment on your experience with survivors. What are some of you talk through a lot of the practical, housing, employment, those sorts of challenges, but what are some of the personal and health consequences, mental health, but even other types of health, however you want to answer that, but of having a record like that? Does it keep people in trafficking sometimes? Does it have them re-traffic sometimes? Or just what a stigma, all that whole range of kind of personal health consequences.
I want Shamere to start on this, but I know both of our answers is yes.
Okay. So
yes,
and I know it's complicated, but I want to hear some details, some stories.
Right. I want Shamere to give the details, but the answer is yes to all the things.
It's complicated. And when we talk about like just the mental health of a criminal conviction, right? So I'm going to speak to this through the survivor's lens, right? So coming out of being extracted from your trafficking situation, you're like, great, I don't have to deal with that physical and psychological abuse right now, right? And you're like, yes, I came out, but I'm still fearful. I still have the shame and the guilt, right? And I'm still not fully understanding how that trauma has impacted my brain to have an impact on how I view myself, how I view others, and how I view the world, right? And so here I am dealing with all of that, right? I'm trying to unload all of that and trying to move on this life's journey when, hey, reminder, you have a criminal record. What? So on top of dealing with the trauma that I have experienced, you know, from my trafficker buyers and other parties, right? Now, and let's not talk about prior trauma, prior to the trafficking situation. Now, hello, brain. It's like the brain is saying, hello, you also have a criminal conviction. And, you know, that criminal conviction, you're like, well, you know what? It doesn't bother me now, right? And I'm going to give you an example. When I came out my trafficking experience, right? I ran away from my trafficker 6 months later, and I thought, you know, the only thing I had to worry about is him coming after me and my family. So even though I escaped, I would call him every single day, like, hello, right? Just to kind of see where his mind is, if he was really coming after me. That was my main concern. Is he coming to kill my family and I, right? When I realized that he was saying, come off my phone, you're on the phone with the police, I'm like, oh, he thinks I'm involved with the police. Then he's not coming after me then. So then when I first escaped, I didn't go back home immediately because I thought he was coming. So when he told me, like, you're on the phone with the police, I decided to go back home. When I went back home to live with my mom, guess who showed up, y'all? The FBI. Why did the FBI showed up? Because I drove across state lines as a direct result, under the direction of my trafficker, right? So I'm now hit with a charge. Right? And I'm like, what? Why am I faced with this charge? So the one, now I'm dealing with all this other stuff over here. Like, I can't tell my friends where I were, right? Some friends may know because of my arrest records and the word is out. Oh my gosh, they're thinking all these things, right? The stigma that comes along with it, right? So now I'm hit with this charge. And I'm going to tell y'all, my first thought, because I wanted to be a lawyer, I can't be a lawyer anymore because I have a felony, right? Then when I got the charge, I had to register as a sex offender, right? Because under the Marshall Act, any crime that is sex related, you must register as a sex offender, right? Now, the second thought that came to mind wasn't about me not becoming a lawyer. Now it's, I need to take my life. I got to commit suicide. What? All of this happened, and now I have a charge. And not only do I have this charge, like, I have to register as a sex offender. And when you think about the sex offender registry, you're thinking about what automatically comes to people's mind is individuals who have molested kids or hurt children in a sexual way. You're not thinking that if you pee in public, you have to register. You're not thinking that, Shamere, you were trafficked, and because your trafficker forced you to drive, and sex trafficking involves sex, so the courts see that as a registrable offense. That's why I'm not going to be able to explain that to people that, hey, this is the breakdown of the sex offender registry. If I tell people I had to register as a sex offender, they're going to be like, ooh, you touched kids. And I was like, I didn't touch any kids. Now I am like, you know what? I can't move on with life. I can't explain this. I don't know how to cope. It's best I end my life. Life is over for me. Right? And I'm going to tell y'all what helped me. My probation officer said I had to go to speak to a psychiatrist that deals with sex offenders, right? And when I went to that psychiatrist in the very first session, I spoke to him for an hour, and he said to me, why are you in my office? I work with real sex offenders, and from what you're telling me, you don't belong in my office. He says, I'm going to write a letter to probation to tell them why you don't belong in my office. Right? A part of that, he wanted to not just give his expert advice, but he wanted to combine that with a polygraph, right? and then I had to take a polygraph. And I know my story, but that polygraph was also nerve-wracking because it identifies when you're nervous, when you're sweating, if you're lying, right? These sensors in your body go off. And so the guy's like, I'm going to ask you 10 questions, and I want you to just answer them truthfully. So I'm sitting there like, I don't need a polygraph to tell my story. I know what happened to me, right? So the first time I did the questions, I'm like, yep, that happened. Yep, no, yes, nope, right? And the needle didn't move. And when you take a polygraph, the needle moves left or right because your body is responding. And he started to check, is the machine defective, right? Now I got nervous on the second time. So now the needle is moving. And then he explained to me, hey, this normally doesn't happen. And I'm like, I don't need a machine to tell me my truth. I know my truth, right? So I was able to, before I did this polygraph, because before you did the polygraph, you have to answer like 500 questions about if you ever touched children and what effect did that have on you. And those questions made me upset. Right. And I crushed up the paper and I threw it in the trash. And they said, if you don't take this polygraph, you go back to jail. And I told the secretary, call them now because I'm not answering those questions. Right. And that secretary said to me, she sat down and she had a conversation with me. And she explained to me that, listen, those questions doesn't define me. Those questions aren't not saying that I'm a sex offender. Right. And she helped me understand what the whole process was about. So, okay, I got over that. Right. And I got involved in this work and I was doing the work. Right. For a couple of years, Loyola University Chicago heard about my story and said, hey, your story is centered around our mission, social justice. We will offer you a full scholarship to complete your degree since I was trafficked out of college. So what I did, I packed up from my job in DC, moved to Chicago to finish my education. And guess what? This was like 10 years later, 10 years of my trafficking experience later. When I got to Chicago, because of my criminal conviction, I couldn't find a place to live. Did I tell y'all that I was involved in this work, doing speaking engagements, working on state laws, doing all this stuff? Back in school now, and can't find a place to stay. For the first 3 months, I couldn't find a place to stay. Dropped out of classes, right? I was failing. And you know what I did? You know what I thought about? Jessica, what do you think I thought about then?
Thought about them? Is that what you said?
Back then, in that moment of me going back to school.
Back then, I'm sorry.
Yeah. What do you think I thought about?
I'm to blame for all of this. I am to blame.
And you know what? I might as well go back to being trafficked. Because I remember my trafficker telling me, society's not going to accept you. They're going to see you as a hoe. Yep. And I'm just using the term he used, right? Nobody's going to accept you. You could leave me and do whatever you want to do, but let me see how that works for you. And the lies that he told me were replaying in my head. He was right, because here it is that a university is saying, hey, come, get this scholarship, but I can't find a place to live to take the classes. So I thought about going back to the life, and I called my old supervisor and I was like, what's the sense of trying to move forward when every time I move forward, it's in my face. It's in my face. It makes no sense. Samantha Vardaman, Senior Director of Shared Hope Now, right? She talked me out of that one. And I shared this story, not just to share my experience, but to answer the question and give you some practical steps. And if you notice, each part of the story that I shared, there was some support available to me. There was some support there because in my head, I saw things differently. But I had the secretary, I had Samantha, I had other people telling me, Shamere, this does not have to be your reality. Let's move forward. Let's continue to fight. You've been fighting. Why stop now? And those people encouraged me to believe in myself when I didn't have the energy to believe in myself. Right? And so those are some practical things of to how I've known other survivors, been out their trafficking experience for 25 years, working for the federal government for over 10 years. And then boom. Oh, we didn't see this during our hiring process. You're fired. After working for 10 years, being out of their trafficking experience for 25 years, doing the work, right? So when we talk about the implications, they could be immediate or they could be 25 years down the road. When we talk about these criminal, the impact of the criminal penalties on your psyche.
Yeah, and
Shamere,
I love how you immediately reverted to every single thing that your trafficker had ever told you about yourself, right? And we're so big in this movement about, your experience doesn't define who you are. What you've been through is not who you are. Well, the criminal legal system ain't listening. They're not listening to that, right? Because every time you think you get out, they can drag you back in. And I have worked with survivors, just like it makes more sense. It's easier for people to wrap their heads around, like right at the moment, right? Like right after the trafficking experience ends. But I like that you highlighted, 20 years from now, 25 years after. A colleague of mine just worked with a survivor who's been out for close to 20 years. Guess what? She wanted to chaperone her daughter's school trip. And she couldn't because of her criminal record. And so every single time that happens, you get dragged sometimes back into those, flashing back to those experiences and dragged back into that trauma, quite literally in your mind. But it perpetuates every bit of victim blaming that we have worked as a community to counteract. It just supports all of that. It supports everything that traffickers say to their clients, to their victims. It supports everything that certain law enforcement officers say to people who are picked up. And then we all of a sudden are confused as to why survivors can't just move on. Well, we're asking too much of someone. There's only so much of a well of resilience that people can access when they're trying to put their lives back together. In the immediate sense, right? Having a criminal record, someone is more likely to continue to live on the margins, right? Where arrest is common, continue to struggle with homelessness, continue to struggle with addiction. And so just having a criminal record begets additional criminal charges, begets additional difficulties with employment, with housing. And guess what, folks? When people have been trafficked, they know how to survive, and they can always go back to that, right? And when they go back to that, that is where a trafficker can re-emerge, and someone can return to, exactly like Shamere said, what they know. And so as an anti-trafficking community, we have to prioritize making sure that these roadblocks, that the way that you described, are eliminated, or at least moved the hell out of the way.
Thank you. I think we should maybe move on. We'll have another chance for Q&A at the end, and we've got a couple other pending questions. But Jessica, why don't you share the rest of your slides and we'll go from there.
You'd think 18 months after the pandemic started, I'd know how to use Zoom without mistakes. I'm going to go briefly through Wisconsin's criminal record relief law. But Jean, there is someone who's going to be talking in greater detail about Wisconsin's law. So I'm basically just giving you a primer, okay? And we can kind of go from there. So Wisconsin does have a criminal relief law, and I actually just want to move you all out of the way here. Hide thumbnail video. Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to give you a primer as to what Wisconsin's law says, some of the procedure, and then some of the both strengths and weaknesses that we use, or that we considered when we graded Wisconsin and gave you all 44. So essentially, Wisconsin's law is based on the fact that at any time after a person has been convicted of prostitution, the court may, upon a motion, vacate the conviction, or may order that the record of the violation be expunged if the person was a victim of trafficking for purposes of a commercial sex act under state or federal law, and the person committed the violation as a result of being a victim of trafficking for purposes of a sexual act. And there is meaning to all of those words that we're going to talk about. All right, so some of the procedure. In order to prove that the survivor legally deserves the access to this form of relief, they may include certain things to support their claim. Like I said, sometimes I've worked with survivors, for instance, who were street-based homeless at the time that they were trafficked by another street-based homeless person 20 years ago before we knew what trafficking was. So we don't really, in those cases, we don't necessarily really have anything to provide to the court as proof other than the person's word. And thankfully, Wisconsin understands that that is enough. But if you want to, you can include certified records of federal or state court proceedings, certified records of notices and certifications from federal immigration proceedings, official documentation of a person's status as a survivor of trafficking from a federal, state, or local agency, and then other, quote, relevant and probative evidence of sufficient credibility to sustain this motion. Excuse me, I would say Baltimore's. Maryland's statute is similar in that we can include a whole host of other documentation to support the survivor's story. And sometimes something that's relevant and probative, for instance, would be the survivor's participation in an anti-trafficking program, the survivor's participation in a detox and rehabilitation program, just essentially anything to bolster the survivor's claim that they have indeed survived trafficking. The survivor has to serve the district attorney in the jurisdiction where the case was prosecuted. So in the case has to be brought in the county where the conviction is. And then the district attorney has to be able to respond, but there's no timing requirement for this response, which gives me pause, because then that means that perhaps the district attorney's office could sit on this for 6 months if they wanted to. So some of the challenges and strengths, I actually should have reversed these. Let's go through the strengths first. So the first thing is that there are no significant timing restrictions for filing. Like, you don't have to file within 10 years of the conviction or within 3 years of the conviction. Essentially, the language dictates that you must file, quote, with due diligence, subject to any reasonable concerns for safety. And that's language that we like in the criminal record relief world, because it acknowledges something that Shamere alluded to, that the survivor might not be ready for that right now, right? And they might take, and getting to the point that you are takes time. And Wisconsin's law allows for that. There's nothing that says they have to file within, a certain amount of time after the conviction. It does not require that there's a hearing for survivors who are going through this process. Some survivors want their day in court to say, you know what, you screwed up once. I want you to look me in the face, look me in the eyes, and tell me that this conviction has been, taken off my record. But for a lot of survivors and a lot of people in general, they don't want anything more to do with the criminal legal system. They don't want to stand up in front of a courtroom and in front of a judge, because it brings on a lot of secondary panic and trauma. So it's nice that there is no requirement that the survivor appear at a hearing. The nexus that the law requires between the trafficking and that conviction, the standard is, quote, as a result of. That is less restrictive than other states and allows more survivors to access relief. So for instance, if I am, there's a difference between someone who is told by their survivor to go out and engage in acts of prostitution. So I am told to do that. And as a direct result of that, I go out and I engage in the act of prostitution. There's a difference between that and someone who is, for instance, has escaped their trafficker and is living on the margins of society in order to escape detection or to feed a drug habit that they've developed or that has sustained them. And they have criminal convictions that result from that. I feel comfortable as an attorney arguing that that is as a result of the survivor's the trafficking experience, even if it's not a direct result. So we like the language as a result of, it's less restrictive and allows, like I said, more survivors to access relief. It doesn't require any tangible proof or documentation of the trafficking experience. The law says it may provide, and like I discussed in the previous slide, that's important because for a lot of survivors, there isn't anything that we can provide. I mean, I worked with a client who had a conviction in 1980. What human trafficking program was she supposed to go to that will now provide her with documentation from 1980? Or the survivor who, and I'm hoping Shamere will pick up on this. I remember a survivor that we both know very well told me at first that she thought what was happening to her was just dating. Right. And she's not going to seek services at an anti-trafficking organization. So it's really important that there's no requirement for tangible proof or documentation. And in reference to the question about minors, Wisconsin's law explicitly includes juveniles. So the law states that a survivor may file if they have been adjudicated delinquent of prostitution. And that's important. And it's just, one less law to kind of keep an eye on, that juveniles are included. Unfortunately, there are more challenges than strengths, and I don't call these weaknesses, I call them challenges, because you have the capability now that you understand what Wisconsin's law means and the things that you can do to improve it. You can go to your legislature and request this. So the biggest one, it only covers convictions for prostitution. It doesn't cover any arrests. And again, it's only for prostitution. So anything that lies outside of that, even if it is as a direct result of someone's trafficking experience, it's not going to be eligible to be eliminated from the survivor's record, whether or not it's an arrest or a conviction. And one of the most puzzling pieces, or another one of the puzzling pieces, is that the law explicitly requires that the survivor state why they didn't seek an affirmative defense at the time of their arrest or trial. And an affirmative defense, the easiest way to understand that is, I did it, but, right? So when you are found to be criminally responsible for an act, your mind has to intend to do it and your body has to do the thing, right? So it needs both of those things. I need to actually physically do it myself, and I have to intend to. Affirmative defense is the best way to kind of relate these to sex trafficking or labor trafficking is if I point a gun at Eugene and I say, go in and rob that store, and you go and you do the thing. Your body physically robs the store, but you're not going in there with the intention of doing so. And because that one piece is divorced from the action that you took, you are legally not criminally responsible for your action. And in the case of trafficking, your body did the thing, but what the reason that you did it, the mind piece wasn't there. You didn't intend to go and do that. You did it because you were under the control or being defrauded or coerced by someone else. So an affirmative defense would allow at trial for me to say, listen, I did the thing, but I was being trafficked. And it's a little bit of a ridiculous assumption to make that someone's going to be in the place to be able to make that kind of disclosure, or that they should have to be able to access this relief. In the National Survivor Network survey that we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, another really interesting statistic was that 80% of the individuals who had been arrested never disclosed their trafficking at the time of their arrest. And that was either because they were scared to, they were told not to by their trafficker, they had absolutely no idea what, if anything, they were going to report, like my client from, that was arrested in 1980, or simply because no one asked. And those are failures, systemic failures that should not be applied to a survivor and required of them to essentially not only prove that they were a victim of trafficking, but prove that they're worth being able to access the relief, even though they didn't tell anyone at the time that they were arrested. The third thing, your statute, Wisconsin statute, is silent on what we call a burden of proof. And a burden of proof refers to the standard that a party who is seeking access to a certain form of relief must meet in order to prove the fact that gets them access, right? So you've heard beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the burden of proof in a criminal case. And that is a very high standard. That allows for a lot of wiggle room in terms of, well, I'm not quite sure 100% that they did this, right? So again, that standard that a party seeking to prove a fact in court must meet in order to prevail successfully, there is beyond a reasonable doubt, there's preponderance of the evidence. And as we kind of go down from beyond a reasonable doubt, the percentage of factual material that you have to produce is lessened. So it would be, we would recommend that there is some sort of burden of proof, but that preponderance of the evidence standard, essentially that states that a survivor must prove that it was more likely than not that they were a survivor. That's a less restrictive burden of proof. So there's just a little bit of wiggle room in terms of, or some concern on our part, that that's not necessarily defined. So the statute also allows unhelpful discretion on the part of the courts. The judge may vacate the conviction or order an expungement, and those are two different things. And we want to make sure if you meet the legal qualifications to access the law, we want the judge to eliminate the conviction and restore the person to the place that they were before that they were convicted. There's no provision to file under seal. Like I stated before, it is the survivor's story that is the bulk of the evidence that they are indeed a survivor of trafficking. And that's a lot of sensitive material, right? And so there's no provision contained within the law that says once this is filed, your average Joe can't walk into the courthouse and actually grab a copy of this. Because remember, criminal records are available to the public. There's no rebuttable presumption if there is official documentation. So for instance, if I provide the court with my Health and Human Services certification when I was seeking, an adjustment of my status or seeking access to immigration relief, that I am indeed a trafficking survivor, we would urge that states include a provision that says if you can produce, you don't have to produce official documentation, but if you do, then it is presumed that you are eligible for this form of relief. So that the statute's silent on that. There's also a little bit of a strange provision at the end where in order to, so you can prove that you are a victim of trafficking, you've met that burden of explaining strangely why you didn't access or seek an affirmative defense. And the judge believes all that, but the judge also has to determine that the person will benefit from eliminating this person's criminal conviction and that society will not be harmed by that. And that just sets the stage for, personal biases to come in. And, I just don't think that I'm comfortable with this person eliminating, 10 prostitution convictions from their record. That's discretion that we don't want the court to have. And then the last thing, it doesn't include any labor trafficking survivors. If we go back, you have to be a victim of trafficking for purpose of engaging in a commercial sex act. And labor trafficking survivors are forced to commit crimes too. And Wisconsin's law does not allow survivors of labor trafficking to access that relief. The last thing that I want to say before we, get into the last portion, I was hinting before to the Survivor Reentry Project. A little bit of history began at the American Bar Association in 2016. It was funded by the Office of Victims of Crime, the feds. There was a little bit of a juggle, you could say, in 2018, where under the Trump administration, the Office of Victims of Crime actually eliminated funding for any legal professionals doing criminal record relief work, which a lot of people don't know necessarily in the Biden administration. Actually, that's a lie. There was enough stink that restriction has since been eliminated. In 2019, the Survivor Reentry Project moved to the Freedom Network. And like I said before, SRP offers resources and training, technical assistance for all of you, and a clearinghouse for confidential survivor inquiries and requests for assistance. I have the website below, and like I said, you will get a copy of all of this. So I just wanted to make sure that you know that this is a one-stop shop. And to the person who said, well, what do we do? You contact the Survivor Reentry Project.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I think because we're short on time, there are several questions that do relate to the Wisconsin law, but I'm going to punt those and ask the attendees to come back for our Wisconsin specific conversation about the Wisconsin law.
Ask the expert.
Yeah.
I'm just giving you a primer.
Right. But a couple quick questions. We just have 5 minutes left. One question, though, from an attendee, I think is relevant. Is law enforcement trained on the signs of trafficking, and are they allowed to use discretion when it comes to making arrests? And I'm sure the answer is it depends, but I mean, generally speaking, does it help to train law enforcement because then they can maybe not arrest or not charge?
So Shamere's done, I believe, a ton of law enforcement training. Do you want to talk about kind of what you think the benefits or the strengths or challenges are of that?
And just real briefly, Shamere, because I have a couple other questions.
I can be cynical, or I can just hold my cynicism to myself.
So what I would like to say is when we talk about trafficking in the United States have been trying to address this issue for the last 21 years, right? And so where we were back in 2000 is not where we are today. Back in 2000, we didn't have the much of education and training given to law enforcement to even help them understand what is happening. So we do have agencies that are getting trained, and training is mandatory. And in certain states, it's even a part of coming through the academy, right? We still have states and we still have agencies that don't believe trafficking is happening in their community, right? And that is the reality. So have we improved from law enforcement over the years? We certainly have. Is there still work to do? Yes, but that really depends on the departments.
Yeah, it's definitely it depends and it depends answer. But one thing I just want to put into your mind is that the United States has a 3-tiered response to trafficking. The first is prosecution of traffickers. The second is prevention of trafficking, obviously working to make sure that people are less vulnerable to being trafficked, and also then services or restoration of survivors. By large majority, the large majority of money and funding goes to prosecution, the prosecution arms, the prosecution of traffickers. So if by law enforcement, we also include prosecutors, right, because they're enforcing the law too, if prosecuting and jailing a trafficker is the #1 priority, where can victims' rights not rank? They can't rank above that. So if this is my priority and I have to arrest a survivor in order to get to the trafficker, I may decide that that's a risk worth taking, and I take a very different view in terms of the harm that causes. So, think about that.
Great, thanks. And so with just a couple minutes left, I wanted to maybe wrap up with a comment on, since this is the national level conversation, on the lack of any federal relief, if there's a way forward to get some of that. And then also maybe comment more broadly across the nation, what are some of the most effective kind of advocacy efforts on these various laws, or to fix the various laws, or to get federal relief? Maybe if each of you could comment on, sort of the advocacy piece, what we could be thinking about here in Wisconsin, but with your perspective from other states and the federal level. Why don't Jessica either one of you start.
I'm going to go first, and I'm going to have Jessica close it out.
Perfect.
I think one of the things that we can focus on when it comes to criminal relief is ensuring that your state has a comprehensive criminal relief plan. So as Jessica stated, that even though we only have 5 states that doesn't have any criminal relief, the majority of the states that do have criminal relief, some form of criminal relief, they only focus on prostitution. Right? And so for your state, have a comprehensive relief where other crimes are included. Jessica just talked about where labor trafficking isn't included, where labor trafficking survivors can also benefit from that criminal relief. So that is one thing that we can work towards, is having that in place. And then I'm going to let Jessica close us out.
Yes. So yes to everything Shamere said. Use the report. Right? We did this on purpose so that you would have, it's very much laid out. And I have just like, I picked up a piece, like, here's a description of the hearing requirement. Here's a description of burden of proof. And you can go through each of those sections that we used to assess people's, different states' criminal record relief laws and figure out how you can shore your states up. So Shamere is 100% right about that. In 2016, there was essentially a federal, the move for a federal vacatur law began. Things are complicated on the federal level, and they continue to be. That fight is not over, but there are different priorities right now that I think are taking up some of the air. People can only deal with so much. There are certain senators that are still focusing on that, and so it's not dead by any means, but I think it's just a waiting game, if Shamere would agree with me on that.
And the bill that Jessica's talking about, that's the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act.
The TSRA. I think what I would leave folks with on this topic, I want us to think back to what Shamere said about survivors driving the process, right? And what I said about prosecuting traffickers as, the be all and end all of our trafficking response. We need to be including trafficking survivors' wishes in that, and letting survivors define justice, right? And Shamere and I have done presentations on this as well. And really letting survivors lead the way. For every survivor, seeing their trafficker in jail is not justice to them. Sometimes, it's just getting the hell out of there and never wanting to deal with this again is what the survivor has decided is justice for them. And when we as a country have defined that prosecuting traffickers at the expense many times of survivors, that's the notion of justice, we are again perpetuating those same fallacies that survivors were taught by their traffickers about their will and their autonomy is not really our concern. And so whenever you are interacting with law enforcement, whenever you're interacting with prosecutorial bodies, you want to make sure that survivor notions of justice are driving the day, because allowing a survivor the room to define their own, future, and to be able to redefine their past in a way that centers them as the expert on their own lives. That's what facilitates healing, and that's what facilitates transformation. And when we forget about that and we kind of do the knee-jerk response, like, well, this trafficker did something horrible, and whatever comes after that doesn't necessarily matter as much, I think we're missing the point. And again, we're perpetuating the blame of victims for their own victimization.
That was an absolutely perfect way to end. Thank you so much, because that really is an emphasis that we share, in streets and everything we do. We try to integrate survivor voices and leadership and wishes, and it needs to be front and center, but sadly it isn't always. But I just want to thank you both so much for this wonderful, incredibly informative webinar. And I will be sending out those, with your permission, Jessica, I'll be sending out those PDF slides later today to all the registered people, and we will get this up online. as quickly as we can. And I do want to commend the next two-way streets sometime later in the fall. We don't have a date yet, but watch your emails for that. So thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Shamere. We really appreciate you, and we look forward to staying in touch. Have a wonderful
you.
fall.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thank you, Shamere
Thank
and
you
Jessica.
guys. Thank you all.
And you're getting thank yous in the chat too from the attendees.
Thank you all for your kind words.
All right. I'll let a few more of them come up. Great. Thanks.